Morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Roy Kamphausen, president of NBR. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our concluding event for NBR's 2-year-long project Into Africa, China's Emerging Strategy. It's an honor to hold NBR's first public in-person event since 2020 about such an important topic as this. This project, generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, comprehensively examines how Africa fits into China's vision for a global order and how it uses political influence campaigns and investments in critical infrastructure to make this vision a reality. Research began for this project with a special report authored by NBR's Senior Fellow for Political and Security Affairs, our colleague Nadège Rolland, who served as principal investigator for this project. And it was entitled A New Great Game, Situating Africa in China's Strategic Thinking. It examined how Chinese strategists envision the continent as a major theater in an escalating geostrategic contest for global influence between China and the US-led West. Contrary to claims by Beijing, and despite the skepticism of many Western observers, this report argues that China is preparing to export elements of its economic and political model to Africa over time, and then the rest of the world, especially the developing world. Building on these findings, NBR published 2 multi-authored reports, the first entitled Inroads and Outposts, Critical Infrastructure in China's Africa Strategy, which examined China's growing presence and investment in infrastructure. And when these investments are placed within the context of China's global ambitions, what emerges from this report is the outline of a future roadmap of Sinocentric globalization. The second report, entitled Political Frontlines, China's Pursuit of Influence in Africa, looked at how China's sophisticated and sprawling system of united front activities have been deployed in Africa. The case studies in this report taken together suggest a larger effort to bring about an incremental transformation of Africa's political landscape in line with CCP principles and preferences. Most recently, NBR published a roundtable collection of essays in the most recent edition of our journal, Asia Policy, entitled Expanding Engagement, Perspectives on the Africa-China Relationship. These essays examine different factors in China-Africa relationships from the perspective of African states. And they also provide a lesson. China has proven to be an attractive source of investment, aid, and support. But in areas ranging from digital infrastructure to COVID vaccines, the US and the West have provided few alternatives and failed to engage with Africa on its own terms. We look forward to discussing these findings at today's event. So before we begin the panel, I'd like to thank the invaluable members of our team who brought this entire project together. First, I'd like to thank Nadège for leading this project as principal investigator, part of a series. For those of you who follow her work, this is it's a delight to be able to see this latest product of her research and analysis. Her efforts in researching and authoring the opening monograph, as well as guiding the case studies, were, as you might imagine, central to this project's success. We're also very grateful for our partnership with the Carnegie Corporation of New York for generously funding and supporting this initiative. I'd also like to thank the senior advisors who assisted in directing and reviewing these research efforts: Ambassador David Shin, Dr. Joshua Eisenman, General Charles Hooper, and D.L. McNeal, who was also kind enough to come and moderate today's panel discussion. And many thanks to the 17 experts who devoted their time and effort to the various project deliverables. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at NBR, particularly Rachel Bernstein, who managed this project so adroitly, and Daniel Schulenberg for their work in putting things together. Also, Audrey Mossberger and Emily Sparkman for organizing today's event in this great setting. Thank you all very much. In a minute, I'd like to turn it over to Dewardric McNeal to start the panel. Let me first briefly introduce him. DL is Managing Director and Senior Policy Analyst at Longview Global. Previously served in the Obama administration working on East Asia and China issues. Also worked at the Brookings Institution's John L. Thornton China Center and advised OCI International, its development and workforce training programs in Africa. He's frankly the ideal moderator for this topic that will range far and wide and with multifaceted explorations. And so, DL, it's a pleasure to turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roy, for the warm introduction, and thank you for all of your years of work and NBR's work on these issues. This issue is extremely important to me. As Roy said, my career has intersected both China and Africa. It's a topic that I've been focused on for quite some time. Unfortunately, I don't think Washington has done a good enough job really focusing in on this issue, but this project really sets a new bar, and I was excited to be asked to join the work that the investigator, who we will meet soon, did, as well as all of the scholars, really helped us to understand how China is looking at this issue. And so often we look at this through the lens of the US and where the US is situated, but this project really drilled down on what China is looking to do in the region. Let me introduce our two panelists joining us here, as well as our panelists on the line, and then we'll get right into this. Sitting to my left is Nadège Rolland. She's a senior fellow for political and security affairs at the National Bureau of Asia Research. Her research focuses mainly on China's foreign and defense policy, its grand strategy, and the articulation of China's vision for itself as a great power on the world stage. And as you heard, she's also the principal investigator for this Into Africa project and wrote a monograph called The New Great Game, Situating Africa in China's Strategic Thinking. Sitting to her left is my good friend Isaac Kardon, and he's assistant professor in strategic and operational research department, China Maritime Studies at the U.S. Naval War College. Isaac specializes in China's foreign policy and writes on China's maritime disputes, Indo-Pacific maritime security, and commerce and China-Pakistan relations. And Isaac's contribution to the project, which I really enjoyed reading, is called China's Ports in Africa, and it was published in the Inroads and Outposts Critical Infrastructure and China's Africa Strategy report. Really good report. I'm looking forward to getting into that. And joining us on virtually is Ovigwe Eguegu, a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. He's based in Abuja, Nigeria, and he specializes in geopolitics with a particular focus on Africa in a changing global order. He researches and provides strategic advice on geoeconomics and security in Africa. And Ovigwe's provided an invaluable perspective in his essay entitled The Digital Silk Road, Connecting Africa with the New Norms of Digital Development. His essay was published in a roundtable essay collection called Expanding Engagement Perspectives on the Africa-China Relationship. And listen, if you have not had a chance yet to read these reports, they're in your seats. I really encourage that you do. There was a lot of valuable information for someone like me who thought I'd focus on this for quite some time, learn and reading these. Let's get into a discussion about the thinking around the project, and we'll talk to our principal investigator. Let me just say, Nadège, the first time this really came to my attention, I was in China living and working in Yangzhou. And all over CCTV, there was an announcement about this Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And it was the first one. And I didn't pay much attention to it until the delegation started to arrive in Beijing. And I thought, wow, China really has a focus on this. There was no strategy yet, but you could tell that there was something in there, and this was over 20 years ago, that there was something that they were thinking about with respect to the continent and its broader foreign policy. So certainly we moved quite a ways away from that first FOCAC, but tell us what you were thinking about when you look at China's role in Africa as it has progressed from that period of time to this project.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, DL, for being here. And before I start, I want to echo Roy's thanks for you, Ambassador Shin, Josh Eisenman, and General Hooper for their guidance throughout the project. All the thanks that Roy mentioned, I really want to join. I've also learned so much, and this report really, or this series of report, couldn't have happened without all the participants and contributors. So I really want to say a lot of appreciation for your collective work here. Going back to your question, this was actually the main question behind this project. You know, there's a lot of visible activities going on, and that have been going on for the past 20 years in the China-Africa domain. There's also a lot of scholarship about this very dynamic relationship. There's also various centers of excellence that are actually dedicated to studying this particular relationship. But what was intriguing to me was the specific focus on only a particular side of the issue, which is mostly, you know, development aid and assistance and maybe infrastructure building for a vast majority of those, you know, publications. And my question was really trying to figure out, as you clearly mentioned in your introduction, what are, and is there a greater design behind that? Why is Beijing so focused on the African continent? And is there something else than the sort of natural, you know, bilateral economic and diplomatic exchanges that any other nation might have? And in other words, is there a Chinese Africa strategy? And when I say strategy, it's not, you know, the white papers or the official documents that the Chinese party state puts out to explain its activities with the African continent that are polished for public diplomacy purposes, but something more akin to a sort of vision for the future of the continent in a way that better fits China's own objectives, and that would provide the foundation for China's various action plans. And this question didn't really come out of nowhere. You know, around 2000, in the period between 2008 and 2012, the Chinese party state, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and of China overtaking Japan as the second world economy, started to re-examine its strategy and its global strategy, not in a narrow sense or in a regional sense, but in a global sense. And Chinese strategies began to contemplate the necessity back then, 10 years ago, of proactively shaping the global environment in a way that would allow for China's rise. And they expected that the upcoming period would see an intensifying competition or geostrategic contest with the West and the US in particular, as it would challenge the American hegemony. And in this particular context, they identified the developing world in general as and the African continent as the cornerstone of the developing world, as an indispensable piece in what they foresaw as this new great game. You know, they really talk about it in those terms as a geostrategic chessboard, and Africa being one of the chess pieces on this chessboard, opposing China against the broadly defined West. And as you will see, if you take the time to read the first report of this series, in 2015, the party state mandated a group of Africanists in China to try to help them figure out what this strategy, what this vision for the future of Africa should look like within this context of increased geopolitical rivalry, and in order to allow for China to establish itself as this great power on the global stage. And their publications, some of them are available, some of them have some classified versions, so we cannot really read them, but they give us a chance to take a peek at the directions that they would like the party state to take. And some of those directions are not very surprising, and they're pretty much expectable. Others are, I found, were less expected, or at least more surprising to me anyway. They give us 4 main directions that they would like the party state to continue its efforts. The first, obviously, is the economic domain and economic development. They see the African continent. I should pause for just a second here and say something. When they talk and write about Africa, they use the term Africa in the same way as a geopolitical construct, in the same way we use Indo-Pacific, right? Not really differentiating the different countries, the diversity, the various models of economic or political development. They see it as a whole, just like what we do with the Indo-Pacific. So Africa is always called Africa without looking at its diversity and complexity in those discussions, at least. So they see, in the economic domain, they see Africa as a great future potential for China's own economic development, looking at the potential rising middle class and potential African customers for Chinese products, future overseas markets for Chinese companies, and trying to, it seems like what they would like to do is trying to transform the continent in an integrated platform that would be a sort of a low-cost manufacturing platform that would be integrated within what China calls the dual circulation process, which is relying more on its own domestic markets, but relying also on some of the international markets to better defend itself against Western potential economic frictions or even sanctions in the future. So a sort of isolated bubble that would rely a lot on Africa. And that goes beyond really the pure mine extraction or even infrastructure building that we have started to look at in the 2 decades that you also have observed the relationship. The second domain is the diplomatic area. So there too, it's sort of expected. This is something that China is not really unique in the sense that it sees Africa as and its 54 countries as a potential source of voting power in international institutions, and maybe as a way for China to continue to deploy and develop its influence over international institutions in ways to push for its preferred concepts and visions for international norms, and to endorse China as a leading country that has a different set of norms and values that it wants to promote, and having African countries endorsing and legitimizing those norms and values. The security and military power projection is not as prominent in those strategic discussions. There is a recognition that as China's influence and interests are expanding, it will have to consolidate its security relationship and defense relationship with African countries. But perhaps because those discussions do not include People's Liberation Army scholars, they're not so much focused on the development of bases or the future of operational deployments on the continent. I think, as Isaac Kardon will probably say in a few minutes, you can see that there are things that are already happening that may point into certain directions, but we cannot tell for sure as of today what their thinking is in this specific military realm yet. The last and, to me, least expected domain that they're very focused on is what I call, or what they call, the ideological struggle. And you know, here I'm going to quote a recent paper by one of the Africanists who participated in this thinking back in 2015, who says, the ideological contest centered on values may become an important aspect of the contest between the US and China in Africa in the coming period. The strategy under discussion envisions the export of relevant elements of China's not only economic governance model, but also political governance model. And it seems like they're recommending the party state to increasingly project its quote unquote experience or China model or China solution as a source of quote unquote, also because these are the terms that they're using, inspiration for African countries, both in terms of, again, economic development and political governance. So here, what they're thinking is not necessarily a cloning of China's own system, political or economic, but maybe some elements of what China has done domestically that could serve some African countries' purposes, or at least that's what they would like. And this inspiration is not just passive. You can see, and through our report on political influence, you can see that there's a lot of architecture and a lot of activities that are going on in this space that are organized in order to influence political elites, but also young generations and wider publics. And we can return to that in the discussion if you want. I regret that Mareike Ohlberg, who was supposed to be here today to talk precisely about those influence operations, cannot join us today. She's got some medical issues. So I'll try to replace her and answer any questions that you may have on this topic. I'm just going to conclude very rapidly because I really want to leave the time for others to talk. Those documents give us some, I think, precious indications about where the internal debate is going. And as you said, you know, there's an evolution into the Chinese perception of the continent and what it can do to achieve its broader goals. And I think it tells us a few things. The first, China doesn't envision itself as a regional power. It really nurtures a globally oriented strategy. So I think that's the first lesson. Second, this strategy is not purely defensive. You know, I think there's a debate among China observers that are struggling with the idea that China is doing this only to defend itself and to legitimize the party, the CCP, back at home. Here, what we can see is the inception of something that is much more proactive, trying to shape the choices and decisions of others in a way that is, again, more on the offensive side than just defensive one. Third, it gives us indications about the fact that this is not just about, or not exclusively focused on economic development. It rather aims at including the African continent as an integrated part China's sort of maybe in the future exclusive, sphere of influence as envisaged in the dual circulation idea. And finally, I think this gives us also indication that it doesn't preclude the possibility of China exporting its model. And I think people still struggle to understand or to accept the idea that there is this possibility in a more proactive way in the future. We may not have seen much in this space yet, but I think we shouldn't dismiss this issue altogether and really start focusing on this, because this will have a great impact in the futures of the continent. It may or may not be successful. China wants, Africa may not want, and China may succeed in some areas, but African countries are not just the subject of this relationship, they're also actors of it. And of course, they're going to make their own decisions and see what fits best their own interests. I will stop with that now, and I'm really, I'm over time already. I'm really looking for the conversation with my colleagues.
Thank you, Nadège, for framing the project for us. We're going to get Isaac and Ovigwe in the conversation. Let me start with you, Isaac. Nadège, I do want to come back and talk about United Front work after we get Ovigwe done, because it's such an important contribution to the project and to what China is doing on the people-to-people side.
Yeah.
And that report was so rich with information and data that I definitely want to come back and talk about that. But Isaac, let's turn to your essay, because you wrote for the critical infrastructure part of the project, and you wrote about ports. And in this town, ports is such a hot button issue. And in reading your essay, it was a real reminder for me that what you see when you look at China's engagement in Africa often depends on where you sit. And I sat for so long at the Defense Department. And so looking at ports for me, the only thing I would think about primarily was PLAN or PLA Navy's operation in these ports. Are they deep water ports? Can you pull a sub in? Reading your essay reminded me, though, that there's more to what we're seeing than what perhaps I viewed before reading your report. And you come up with this term, strategic strong point, and you focus on the ports as what you say, an integrated presence. And that's important given where your essay was in the project, which is this critical infrastructure piece. So how should we look at what's happening with respect to ports in China? And where have we gotten, at least if not wrong, where have we not gotten the full and complete story? That's what your essay was about for me. Can you help us understand that?
I can try, Deal. Thank you for the probing question, and thanks so much to Nadège and to Roy and to Ali and NBR for providing a platform for me to integrate some of my work on this for several years now, starting with the NARP program, I think in 2019. And so it's really been a pleasure to develop this work in collaboration with you. So thank you for that. And yes, Deal, I think you picked up on a really important thing that I was trying to do, and I'm glad that it came through. And part of that has to do with how well conceived this project is, just to say, looking functionally at critical infrastructure. It would be a mistake to look at China's interests and motivations in this as purely being to support naval presence in Africa. I think that is one positive externality, perhaps, is the way that looks from the PLA's standpoint. But ultimately, what I try and do is contextualize China's position in ports in Africa as part of their overall maritime power program. And so that, I think, is complementary in a lot of ways with this broad strategic vision that Nadège has laid out so ably. And ultimately, Africa, from that vantage, from the vantage of China's interest in developing maritime power in order to support itself as a regional and then global power, there are a lot of both supply and demand factors, is the way that I kind of stylized it for the piece. Starting with the demand side, there are a lot of reasons why Africa is an extremely attractive place for Chinese enterprises, and not just critical infrastructure, but ultimately the reason it's called critical infrastructure is because it's necessary, it's critical for other economic functions. And I think ports perhaps uniquely so given the basically maritime lines of communication between China and Africa. That is all of the trade going on between China at some point, between China and the African continent at some point is getting passed through a port on one or the other coast of Africa. And so it's an interesting place to kind of start the journey into Africa and think about how China is positioned there. And so demand-wise, the sort of obvious points of demand are Africa is a huge continent that's extremely rich in resources, and that is particularly underserved by infrastructure. And so there's a huge demand side, both from China's perspective, as well as, we should importantly acknowledge, from the perspective of African nations and African businesses, perhaps less so the African people. We could talk about that discussion, but ultimately from a commercial standpoint, the extraction of resources that are not being fully produced and are not able to come to market is really the driving demand factor for China. Africa almost uniquely looks very, very attractive from that standpoint. And this kind of feeds into some of the supply factors that I focus on. And ultimately, that's where I have a little bit more comfort in understanding what are some of the political and even industrial policy drivers from the Chinese side that have allowed China to take such a significant market share in African ports and maritime transport in general. And some part of this is that ports have been central to China's own domestic development model. The way that they market ports across the African continent, as well as in South Asia and in Europe and in Latin America, is that you can become Shenzhen. You want to be the Shenzhen of East Africa. You want to be that. Sometimes, depending who they're talking to, they'll sometimes market it as the Singapore or the Dubai of. But when Chinese interlocutors are talking about this to one another, it's the Shenzhen model, it's the Shoko model in particular, and it's this idea. And this kind of feeds into the strategic strong point idea. It's this idea that the port really functions as a centerpiece of a broader ecosystem that facilitates trade. Trade is the basic function, and there are other kind of peripheral things going on. But without a modern port that can take big container vessels in particular, and also bulkers, and without it being connected in a very significant way to intermodal infrastructure, so roads and rails and proximate airports, there's not a lot of hope of increasing trade volumes. There's, from the perspective of a sort of the African continent, there's not a lot of prospect of bringing very rich resources to market and to feed China's essentially insatiable demand for a lot of inputs from Africa. And here I'm not just talking about oil and gas. There are probably many here who understand the various minerals far better than I can say just confidently that there are a lot of minerals that China is almost entirely dependent on extracting out of various African countries. And so this looks very attractive from that standpoint. And what they have is a ready-made model effectively for doing this, and one that scales well. And this is part of the supply side, and this is part of the story of China's infrastructure and frankly, other investment globally over the last 10 or 12 years, which is that because their development model was so infrastructure intensive, so investment led, there's tremendous overcapacity in China for this. There's a lot of labor that would otherwise be idle. There's capital, arguably, that would be otherwise idle. And Africa looks like the most attractive place for that. In particular, because of Africa's position in China's broader vision of its geopolitical position. I've looked a lot at China's sort of strategic community's views on this key sea line of communication stretching from East China across the, through the Malacca Straits, across the Indian Ocean, and then forking either up into the Gulf, Persian Gulf, where something on the order of 40% of Chinese oil exports come from, but then also over to the African continent, up through the Red Sea, up into the Mediterranean. And so ultimately, Africa is sort of the pivot in this, what they call maritime lifeline for China's own economic development model. And so I've been really trying to think through how Chinese strategists and Chinese planners are integrating this in their own mind. And Africa looms very large in that, just in a physical sense. You can read it off the map. It's right there. It's right at the pivot. They're looking at European markets as their current biggest export markets, but over the long term, as Nadège was pointing out, Africa is probably the most attractive place for this dual circulation idea. And that requires long-term investment in capital infrastructure. There's no prospect of Chinese manufacturing, Chinese resource extraction, Chinese industry, other Chinese economic enterprises that are touched on in your volume without some of this critical infrastructure. And ultimately, that's why they're there. And so just as a last point on the military and security dimensions, naturally, DL, we at the Naval War College are also very interested in that. And I'm constantly being asked about that. And what I'm trying to do, and I'm heartened that with some success from your perspective, is just put that in context and start to recognize that the PLA is a little bit late to the game in some ways. I don't believe there's much evidence supporting the idea that the PLA is somehow driving this enterprise. The PLA is being opportunistic about this very big portfolio of ports around the world. Africa is one of several places where they're interested in extracting as much dual use capability as they can, in large part because there isn't a big network of bases around the world, and yet the PLA is tasked with a global mission set. And so this is sort of their, I would argue, short to medium term solution for this. I think Nadège is exactly right. It's pretty hard to say exactly how this is going to develop over time. This is not something by its nature that this is the sort of thing that is very closely held from a PLA standpoint or from civilian leadership standpoint. But we see extensive dual use of facilities in Africa. Of course, the very first formal overseas base is on the east coast of Africa in Djibouti. And there are evidently advanced negotiations going on the west coast in Equatorial Guinea. And I would hazard to guess probably anywhere where the host government is willing to talk about it with China, there's an interest in it because there is huge demand for power projection, ultimately. I will leave it for further discussion, the extent to which they could reliably expect these ports to provide that kind of power projection, but ultimately I think it fits in neatly in this package of ports serving as an integrated platform serving Chinese interests in Africa. And these are primarily economic and commercial, but they of course have political dimensions and strategic and military ones as well.
Thank you, Isaac. We'll come back to some of that in the discussion through questions perhaps, and I certainly have some additional thoughts. Let's get Ovigwe into the conversation. Ovigwe, thanks for joining us. Listen, I really enjoyed your essay. You know, it focused on digital infrastructure, and it's a topic that I think we're all trying to wrap our heads around. And you know, you did an excellent job in your essay here. You know, your essay was also a lesson to me. Quite frankly, I learned a lot of lessons as an advisor to the project and as a recipient of its knowledge. But you warned that everything that's going on in Africa should not be viewed through the U.S.-China strategic competition lens. And I think that's important. And, you know, when Nadège was talking about this project, it was important to really understand African agency as it relates to China's engagement on the continent. And Isaac spoke about this a little bit, that there's a demand signal there. And oftentimes what we're seeing is China being willing to or able to supply that demand signal. And there are some people in Africa, perhaps the elites and others, who are receptive of that. But can you talk to us a little bit about the digital infrastructure space, how we should look at what China is doing there, and how Africans in the places where China is engaged in those various countries view China's engagement in this space? Ovigwe?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. My sincere thanks to NBR for the invitation to contribute to the series of essays, and also particularly to Madam Rolland for inviting me to speak on today's event. Now, with regards to Digital Silk Road, I think it's a very important component in China's global strategy, and not particularly even with Africa as an example. And then, of course, you mentioned that it's not really, we shouldn't look at it from that, angle of strategic competition between both sides. But I will also argue it's actually very important to take that into consideration when we're talking about the development of digital infrastructure. And so for that, let's even look at what these perspectives really are from the research. Of course, you see when the Chinese perspective on the digital Silk Road is that it aims to bridge the digital divide between the the developed world and the developing, countries, and allow for African economies to, to grow, particularly the digital economy, right? And that will have knock-on effects on other segments of their, or sectors rather, of the economy. And then on the other hand, you have the US perspective, which of course recognizes that digitalization of African countries is actually very important for their own development. If not, you wouldn't find the likes of Google and Amazon building, data centers and investing on the continent. But where it takes a problematic turn, in a sense, it's the emphasis, or at least the argument, that China's digital Silk Road, or Chinese technology, is going to embolden authoritarianism on the continent, or at least the technology becomes a tool for authoritarian governments to assert their influence. Now, those two perspectives, like I said, is very important. We shouldn't take them out of the context or out of the analysis. And then let's look at what African countries actually are, or are saying, or where they really stand in terms of the digitalization process. Now, if you look at research, that was by the World Bank actually estimates that just a 10% increase, in internet penetration will lead to a 2.5 increase in GDP in Africa, right? And then you have, and that is also, embellished by national development plans for digitalization, like in Nigeria, for instance, where internet penetration is, very much less than 50%, or about 50% rather. And then you have, the African Union digital transformation strategy, which aims to create a single, digital market by 2030. And there's so much potential. A report by Google, for instance, says by the potential of digital economy development will add 180 billion to Africa's GDP. So the numbers are staggering and massive. And that report still says that investment is nowhere near what it should be for African digitalization to actually become a reality. So when you look at the vision by countries, and also at the continental level with the AU strategy I mentioned, and then you look at all of the potential that was done by World Bank and all of these impressive organizations, then it becomes clear that needs and investment would trump narratives or suspicion. Because when you are, for Nigeria, for instance, 200 million people, you don't even have internet penetration that covers 60% of the population. If you are elected into office, of course, one of the ways you want to grow the economy is to look at very easy, very low-hanging fruit, or easy areas to drag in investment into. And then you are going to see good figures because all of the research is being done. So that's why you see there's so much interest on African government in terms of collaborating with just about anybody. And I think I have to emphasize that it's not as if there's preference for China itself. I will touch on certain areas where there's complementarity, but broadly speaking, it is a case of we need digital infrastructure, we need it now, and I will always say digital infrastructure, we cannot look at it in the same lens as traditional infrastructure like ports and roads and all of and railways. Those are very important. But I remember at an event where I was invited on to speak at the LSA, I mentioned that when we look at US perspective, of course, it's value driven, and then you hear emphasis on democratic values and all of that in constructing infrastructure. Now, there are no democratic roads. I mean, you can't judge roads by their value on democracy and all of that. The real issue when we're talking about infrastructure development should be, can countries pay for it? Can they afford to pay and avoid getting debt distress or debt default? That is the most important value, not necessarily the democracy and rights because of the urgency, right? But at the same time, when it comes to digital infrastructure, you can actually make a case for values because there's something called a democratic internet, right? The internet and how you look at what it means for for discourse power, for for rights and all of that it's very important, right? So there is that component that also makes African countries look to just about anybody. So, and that's why I always say it's not a case of preference, because they know within their populations, people and even the public, they appreciate everything that's, they appreciate several things within the packages, each actor is providing. So that's very important. And then secondly, we also have to look at the the digital Silk Road, again, like you did mention, through certain component areas where there are complementarities between African countries. For instance, it's the subject of digital sovereignty, right? And when it comes to digital sovereignty, for African countries, of course, it is very important that they are beginning to actually realize, or at least acknowledge, the fact that the ability for them to control the data traffic, or where the data really is, we should be within the domain of governance, or governance oversight, right? And currently, nearly 90% of Africa's international data traffic actually goes through servers based outside of the continent, 56% of the US, and then 32% in the European Union, right? Or at least within Europe. So very little actually is within their control. And then you have China, who actually recognizes digital sovereignty, and speaks to digital sovereignty as a core component or principle of the digital Silk Road. So immediately there is there's a pull factor, it makes it an attractive an offering for African countries. And again, there's also interest in investment as well, because we have to also mention, like I said earlier on, if you look at the potential for investment, it is massive, and then the Chinese are ready to invest. So, and African countries where they've already realized that an affordable, reliable, universal digital access is key to their development, of course they are going to jump at this opportunity. So with that, I just want to give a general overview of what the paper was about, and hopefully that's help give an insight into it.
That was great. Thank you, Ovigwe. We have just a few minutes before we get into our Q's and A's. I want to come back, Nadège, to talk a little bit about United Front work and its role in terms of China's approach to Africa. So many of us who've done people-to-people engagement over the years, and we all know that that's important, but sometimes there's a lot more to what's happening than many of us know. And Mareike's paper was really excellent in sort of laying out the multiple layers of United Front work in Africa through China's strategy. So if you can say a little bit about that, but again, I encourage everyone to read these essays, particularly that one. It's so rich in data. So in the few minutes we have before we get to Q's and A's, United Front work.
Yes, just very rapidly, because this is a topic that I'm very much interested in and have written on a few times. In the US and in Western countries in general, we have become a little bit more knowledgeable about this term, United Front, which even 5 years ago, most of non-specialists didn't know about. And there's been a lot of work and journalistic reports on those activities in liberal democracies, starting from Australia, New Zealand, in Europe, and here in the US as well. And it seems like the developing world is completely ignored from this conversation, as if these activities don't happen there, but they are happening there. And there's a very structured playbook, and those activities are part of the software of how the party state operates abroad. So the idea of the United Front at the strategic level is to form some tactical alliances to engineer an environment that is more favorable to the achievement of the party state's objectives, and while at the same time trying to marginalize or neutralize the ones that may stand in its way. So that's a very broad description of what United Front work is all about. It's in concrete terms, it develops it's a very layered and very structured deployment that starts with managing overseas Chinese communities, but also extends outwards towards co-opting and capturing local foreigners, and influencing the perceptions of the wider public. So it has many different objectives and targets. So on the continent, there is actually an increasing overseas Chinese presence. In some countries, it's been historically present for centuries. And there's a lot of various waves of immigration from China to Africa. The Chinese communities in Africa are very diverse, both in terms of origins and in terms of their presence in those countries. But they are seen by the party state and the United Fronters as essential components of the bridging between China and African countries, and as relays towards local people, and as essential components of nurturing good relationships. Then outside of the Chinese communities, the United Front workers are trying to nurture political elites, either through historical legacies, long-term friendships, economic leverage, and structured programs, including party-to-party training, study sessions, and tours, study tours in China, seminars, and things like that. Increasingly important is also the development of China's presence in local media. We have several chapters in our various reports that are talking about this and how China is increasing this particular focus on media so that it can access and influence the populations of and specifically social media for the young generations of Africa. This is a very important part of what they're trying to do, again, to try to shape and influence the perception of China and trying to push for decisions that are more amenable to China's interests. Specifically, Mareike has, she describes many of those structures that are, if you take the time, visible and easily accessible, so easy to recognize. And she explains also those various targets in African countries. But she also underlines something that Ovigwe just reminded us, which is, when local elites are siding with the PRC on some specific issues, it's rarely exclusively thanks to this United Front work. It goes really hand in hand with the promises of actual needed grants and benefits, material things and benefits that either people or countries really need. So if it was just this influence work without those material benefits, maybe China would be much less successful in partaking in those activities. But I really encourage you. I'm very proud, of the whole project, but this particular project on political front lines was important to me because it really puts a big continent back on the map of China's influence operations that people are just starting to understand in our Western countries, but really yes, making the point that it happens everywhere, and the toolbox is pretty much the same. The goals might be slightly different, but the architecture is there, and it's used in many countries in probably the same ways here and there.
Yeah, no, I found that that essay really enlightening. I mean, those of us who do people to people, again, we sort of at a top level, we understand that this may be going on, but Mareike's essay really talked about some of the organizations that can sound, Friendship Association or Chamber of Commerce. And so there were a lot of things that were factual. I have to admit also that she did it in a way, as the relationship has gotten more toxic between the US and China, and as we've seen some incidents of violence here in this country, we never want to just assume that because someone is Chinese, they happen to be some sort of a third front. And so it's always difficult for me as we have these conversations, but I thought Mareike's essay really did a good job to talk about this in a factual way that didn't paint everyone with a broad stroke. And that's important for me, given my background, that we not target people, but I thought it was a good essay. We're going to move into Q's and A's if that's okay. Let me just do a bit of housekeeping before we do that. So for in-person attendees, you raise your hand and an NBR staff member will bring you the microphone. If you can, give us name and affiliation, and let's try and keep it to a question. A couple of lead-in statements are fine, but we want to try and keep it flowing. For our virtual attendants, you can email your questions to events@nbr.org. And what I'm going to try to do is take 2 from the floor and take 2 from our online attendees. We appreciate them attending as well. So let's open the floor. Let's take 2 from the floor. I saw a hand back here, and then this gentleman here in the second to the last row.
Hello, my name is George. I am student at Georgetown University. I am from the Republic of Georgia, which is also interested in China's emerging power. So my question would be regarding Belt and Road Initiative and what are the prospects of this project? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's take one more from the floor, and then we'll get a response from our panelists.
Tom Parker, George Washington University.
Grab a mic for us, Tom. Thank you.
Would any of the panelists care to comment on the actual and potential field of cooperation between security services in China and in Africa? I know there's a chapter, I think, on police cooperation, which I haven't read. I'm thinking of how much Cuba has done in Latin America. It's one of the relatively few good things they're good at, but they are good at that. So any comments would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you. Belt and Road and security cooperation. I'd love to get Ovigwe in on some of the Belt and Road as well, but I know, Nadège, you've done a lot on Belt and Road, so I'd love to hear from you. But Ovigwe, I want to prepare you to jump in on this one if you can on Belt and Road.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Belt and Road's death has been announced several times since its birth. People were already skeptical about it the day it was announced, and here we are almost 10 years after, and it's still going because it has such a wide array of objectives. It can go in any specific direction and still be alive, basically. People have been focused so much on its infrastructure building component, which was the one that the party state put forward immediately in order to be able to suscitate cooperation and interest from other countries. When you promise $1 trillion in investment in infrastructure, then people start to listen to you, right? So, but there are other domains in which the Belt and Road from the beginning said it would want to expand China's influence, including policy coordination, financial integration, trade, and people-to-people exchanges. And over the years, it would seem like in terms of investments, it's slowing down, investments and grants and loans mostly. It seems like it's slowing down. There's so many big infrastructure projects that you can do anyway, I think. But in other areas, and specifically in energy and in information and telecommunication, it has not slowed down. I think it's still a very important area of investment for China. There are other domains in which people didn't realize that China was serious about developing the Belt and Road, including the health Silk Road that people have heard about around 2021 because of the pandemic. That are the soft components of the Belt and Road that continue to be deployed globally, that may not have as big of an impact on the global stage, but still are ways for China to create those cooperations and insert itself into local countries as well. And the people-to-people component is really sprawling. There are Belt and Road programs for media cooperation, for student exchanges, for maritime cooperation, etc. So it is really pretty much the main architecture for China to deploy its overseas influence. And in one form or another, I think it will continue to stay this way. China has launched the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative that are also pushing this idea of global outreach at the strategic level, but with Belt and Road as the foundation for it. And what was interesting when we worked on the critical infrastructure report was to discover that China didn't see Africa as part of the Belt and Road back in 2013. It happened around 2015, 2016, 2017. It took a while for Beijing to decide to include Africa into the Belt and Road scheme. They had another term for it, which was, I think, one connectivity. Do you remember, Ambassador Shin?
One road.
No, it was, I think, the one connectivity 453 connection, or something like that.
I remember that.
Sorry, I garbled here. But it was another form of infrastructure investment that was specifically dedicated for Africa, and then they expanded it to Africa. Do you want to add something on the port side?
Well, it'd be hard to add that much to your extensive body of work on it, but I feel like by virtue of really unpacking all the diverse elements of the Belt and Road over the course of many years, one of the things, and just your last comment really reinforces that, is that it is a nebulous concept. It's largely a branding campaign. It's being sort of supplanted or supplemented in some way by future programs. And I think ultimately, analytically, it's almost impossible to handle. And that's one of the reasons I think that the critical infrastructure study is so well conceived, is that looking at it functionally, you can start to gain some insights, and ultimately whether it's called one connectivity, three whatevers, or the Belt and Road, or one Belt and Road, one road, global security, global development, the specific drivers originate in China, and it is essentially synonymous with their foreign policy. They're looking for ways to brand it and to market it to different audiences, and they, I guess, focus group tested certain versions of it and ultimately determined that some sort of a global branding element of it was the appropriate way to go. And yeah, I think, maybe it'd be interesting to do like a discourse analysis and see whether or not we start to see Belt and Road displaced by global security, global development initiative. But ultimately the components of it, I think, are recognizable in your earlier work, and it's because they're enduring Chinese foreign policy objectives.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to come back to the security question, but I want to get Ovigwe in, if you can, quickly on Belt and Road and your thoughts about it.
Nadège earlier mentioned that African countries were not initially the objective, or at least a core part of the Belt and Road Initiative. To a large extent, if we look at the number of countries that joined in 2015, which was some years after the initiative was launched, a very significant amount of countries from Africa joined that year. And even with every passing FOCAC, that's how the number has been increasing. So usually it's around that, when you have the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation and the first the visit by the Chinese foreign ministers whenever they're touring the African continent, which is they make their first port of call, you always see the number of countries signing the MOU, increasing. However, I think one of the points also that also needs to be, I like to always emphasize with the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think previous speakers have alluded to, is from what position are you looking at the initiative, right? If you're looking at it from an geo-economic and infrastructure perspective, I mean, with the strings of Pearl theory, to a large extent, we could say the Belt and Road Initiative is in place, right? Because you already have these key ports, whether it's Hambantota or Guada, and the one in Djibouti, that are really strategically located. They are very well they're functioning well, and they are increasing in the ability, of the Chinese military to have a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific and up to the Red Sea and all of that. So it depends on how you're looking at it. And then with the digital Silk Road that came much later than even the health Silk Road that she mentioned also, these are, like you said, soft components, but I would like to emphasize that these components would actually have the most far-reaching impact going to the future, especially for developing countries.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, for instance, the digital infrastructure, on one level, yes, it is needs driven by African countries. African countries need infrastructure, but on the second level, the leadership of the fourth industrial revolution is going to be decided by who would lead the digital revolution. Because if you can lead the technologies, and if you can connect as many countries and economies to your standards and to your leadership of this revolution, you are going to lead the world. So, and if you then consider within that context the sheer amount of countries that are, I mean, now it's 20 countries in the digital Silk Road, but just like with the Belt and Road Initiative, you blink and the next year is 40 countries, is 70 countries, and then it goes on and on and on, like that. So it's now the other, my colleague here mentioned the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative. Those two very recently have been launched. Global Development last year, and then at the Bao Forum earlier this year, President Xi mentioned the Global Security Initiative and how it's going to be underpinned with the principle of indivisible security and all of that. And it's also very crucial to see whenever these initiatives are launched, there's always a component to read that speaks to concerns of a vast majority of the world, particularly countries in the global south. Now, that indivisible security principle, I will argue with anybody that was mentioned specifically because it speaks to the conditions of current geopolitical context, which is the Ukraine war, but also these countries surrounding China, for instance, whether the Pacific Island countries or even in the South China Sea, that are somewhat concerned about the strategic rivalry between US and China and what it means for their own security. So when you say the principle of indivisible security, which is not a Chinese concept, actually originated in Europe, is going to underpin the global security initiative. And that principle actually argues that, of course, security partnership between two countries is not meant to target a third country. Then if you are Thailand or if you are Vietnam or Malaysia, you begin to see that kind of security cooperation with China as benign, as not really targeting the United States. But I think it remains to be seen if that is going to be the case. But already the GSI, countries signing up into the GSI, is already increasing. So that's why I believe with these initiatives, yes, they together they form the grand strategy. But whenever analysis, or from an analytical point of view, it really has to be, disaggregated into what exactly are we looking at? Is it, just the China's global power, but what are the components and how does these these initiatives fit into China's instruments of national power?
Thank you, Ovigwe. Anyone want to tackle the security cooperation piece? I know we had some reporting on that in the project, so.
Right. The chapter on that is written by Paul Nantulia from NTU here in the US. He's extremely well versed in those cooperations, and he observed that the special police units, the Coast Guards, and non-People's Liberation Army, law enforcement forces, their activities on the continent occur much more often than People Liberation Army activities in Africa. And Beijing is still averse to deploy the PLA beyond the Western Pacific. And Chinese security establishment looked for alternatives to protect the Chinese security interests on the continent with boots on the ground. And so organizing these cooperations with local security forces and law enforcement alleviates the impression that China's security footprint is growing. It's mostly under the radar and less visible than port calls or joint exercises. But it actually, for the long term, these police cooperation are getting. It's what Ovigwe said about long-term implications of those entrenchments of digital components. It's the same for police cooperation in trenches. Some skills, some ideas, some ways of actually deploying force on the ground. He said that there's a sort of a blended approach to security, which is also quite different from what we might expect from countries like the US, for example, where it involves all elements of influence, including education, education programs, etc., BRI investment, people-to-people exchanges. So it's also there. You can see that it's multi-layered. It's not always. It's really never one specific angle that is focused on. And what he observed too is that there's an increasing effort to forge a common language between China and African countries in this area. It's what he calls the software of China's engagement. He says that there are striking similarities between Chinese actors and local African actors. And there's again, a lot of activities that are not as evident to the outside eye, but a lot going on in this space.
Thank you, Nadège. Why don't we take 2 questions from our online audience? Another? Okay. Any more from the floor here? Yeah, actually, you were first, and then my friend here. Here? Yeah, here, and then my friend in the yellow tie.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Vikram Nehru. I teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I want to compliment you on an excellent conversation so far. If I may, just 2 quick questions.
Very quick,
First,
sorry,
to Nadège, could you hone in on a specific case study in Africa, one specific African country where the Chinese have exerted political influence through these various channels, how that's worked, and what has the result been in terms of Chinese agencies being able to do things which they otherwise would not have been able to do? What space has been opened up for them through these efforts? And to Isaac and Ovigwe, a little bit more detail, if you could. I know there are something like 60 port projects that you mentioned in your paper. What is the total investment that's being put in? What are the financial arrangements for these investments? Are there any patterns, for example, how much supported by domestic sources, how much finance from non-China international sources, and how much from Chinese financial sources? And in your analysis of these investments, whether they're in ports or they're in telecommunications, are there any potential hambantotas down the road that we need to keep an eye on the implications of that? Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend in the yellow tie, and then we'll get some answers. A lot of that'll be in those reports, though. I encourage you to read them.
All right, good morning, and thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Ben Miles. I'm an international trade specialist at the Department of Commerce. I had a couple of questions here. So some of this may have already been treaded, but how much of Africa is beginning to look like China, digitally, economically, or physically? In my mind, I come back to, China's building of parliament buildings that look very strikingly similar to Chinese buildings in mainland China. And then the other question I had was, is there a way that you see for the US to take advantage of China's infrastructure push while pushing back on political influence that China may be garnering? Thinking of, well, if China builds the infrastructure, could we use that to our advantage? Thank you.
Okay. 2 questions. Isaac, I know you and Ovigwe had some specific comments. I'll ask you guys if you want to address those to the degree that you can. I know a lot of this data is in your report. Ovigwe, you want to get started on that one?
Yeah. So with regards to investment in particular and numbers, for the digital Silk Road, just 6 countries, Nigeria, Angola, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe have received $8.4 billion in investment. And these have gone into things like, data centers, R&D labs, telecommunication equipment, and those kinds of investments. And you would find that a lot of time there's a price advantage, or the competitive advantage is price. That's one. And then also because you also have to realize, for instance, particularly with digital infrastructure, a lot of Africa's 3G and even 2G and currently the 4G was built on Huawei and ZTE technologies, right? So it is very easy for them to just prioritize Huawei and ZTE for 5.0 or for 5G. And that is one of the reasons why there was so much resistance, or from coming from African countries when the ban on Huawei started, and the sort of like the trade war during the Trump administration. And then secondly, it's also important to also note that in certain parts or in certain areas of the Africa's cooperation with China, or Chinese Chinese products on the continent, like with smartphones, Transsion, which is like a conglomerate of for smartphone companies like Itel, I think there are 3 on that Transsion label: Itel, Techno, right, and Infinix. So these are very popular smartphone brands on the continent of Africa. You might not know them in the US, but majority of the smartphones, over 60% of the market share is owned by Chinese smartphones. And it's not even Huawei, actually. It's these 3, Techno, Infinix, and and Itel. But of course, Huawei has a huge share. And I was talking to someone very recently after that LSE event. Someone reached out to me and we're discussing about this issue of investment in digital infrastructure. And I mentioned something. A lot of the success, people don't understand how, or at least don't realize the extent to which the success of Chinese telecommunication companies on the continent. A lot of that success actually is on top of US technologies. So for instance, if you look at the market share of Chinese smartphones, particularly Huawei, it has dropped in the African market and it's been replaced mostly by Samsung. Some of it has been scooped up by Xiaomi as well. But that just happened not because Huawei got uncompetitive, but just because it lost Google, right? So just a very simple action, it was very devastating. And imagine if you do that for all of the other smartphone brands. Immediately there is no Chinese market, they don't market share anymore on the continent. So there's a certain fragility to to the size of market share, or the control and the influence they have. And even if you look at space, Afrin Group, yes, that's a French company. Actually, it's active in Ethiopia, working with Ethiopian, investing, they're assembling, testing satellites, right? Because the Ethiopian government is very keen on making Ethiopia like a digital, power and all of that. And now that's even more of a footprint, for instance, than the collaboration with China on space. Yes, the Chinese have helped them launch 2 remote sensing satellites into orbit, 2019 and 2020, I think, yeah. But if you contrast what they've done in terms of knowledge sharing, which is very important, but also see what Afrin Group, which is a French or European company, is doing, you also see that, again, Ethiopia digitalization is still not really rooted on Chinese component or quote unquote influence and all of that. It's as a friend of mine in Ethiopia said, it's a soup. We want the case where, the salad. We want the case where everybody that can contribute or where they are competitive, we could bring in partners, to invest. So that for me, in the digital space, is the situation. Then on ports, I think the shining example right now, one of the big investments is the Lekki port in Lagos in Nigeria, which was just made operational. About $629 million US, and it's a PPP actually. So it's not, so when the gentleman that asked the question on what the kind of packaging of the investments, a lot of them, yes, will come from Exim, but of course, like I said, with some of this investment, some of them, particularly the one I just mentioned, the Lekki port, is actually a PPP, just an investment, and that's in my opinion seems like it's a very good investment, very decent, because it helps Nigeria unclog and increase its ability to trade more, and also where it's located helps connect with other infrastructure projects. So just to wrap up, if you look at why all of these initiatives are successful, whether it's in digital realm or it's in ports, it is the needs. Once you approach Africa's infrastructure context from a needs perspective, it begins to make a lot of sense, because that is exactly where the success is really coming from. Yes, they might struggle to get some of the financing, but the needs are so massive that just about anybody can come. If you can come in with the financial package, countries are ready to work with you.
Thanks. Isaac, any thoughts on specific countries, projects? I know you list quite a few in your report. I'm thinking of the one that's the most hot button issue in Djibouti, but you also speak a lot about what Obiange and our friends in Equatorial Guinea was doing with respect to those 2 ports, 2 separate coasts, 2 separate ports, but some real good examples of influence.
Yeah, I guess I'd refer for full detail. There is a big table at the end of my piece that'll probably be of interest to you, Professor. But I was able to count 61 separate projects across Africa. So that's not the same as individual contracts for works. In some cases, they have multiple follow-on contracts. And I think before getting to those 2 ports on either side of the continent, just on the financial arrangement side that you asked, it's very challenging to come up with an aggregate figure of here's the amount that China has invested in ports in Africa or in any sector. They obviously do a lot of promotion, and they talk a lot about this $10 billion mega project or that $10 billion mega project. We did a fair amount of digging. I had the support from some able NBR research assistants as well. And even then, you kind of need to make some choices from an accounting standpoint about how you want to count it. And so I don't feel very confident in giving any particular number on it, other than to say it ranges quite widely. It's a substantial outlay of investment, but there's been a lot more discussion than there has been actual capital transferred. And part of the reason it's hard to track has to do with what those financial arrangements are. I track loans associated with a bunch of these ports, and it's the usual characters from China. It's the big policy banks. It's Exim Bank in particular, China Development Bank, that basically are in the lead in a lot of these projects. And the terms of finance are almost never disclosed. I have never seen any of the documentation on it, but what you can infer from the patterns of commercial activity afterwards is that the prime contractor is always a big central state-owned enterprise from China. China Communications Construction Corporation is the leader in Africa as well as most of the world, frankly, on all manner of construction projects. And they have subsidiaries like China Harbor Engineering, China Road and Bridge Corporation, a whole variety that have specialized areas. And basically the finance tends to be, not just tends to be, it is a constant conjunction of Chinese finance and Chinese contractors, whether that's because it's stipulated in the contract or it's just because they're the ones who do this work and they come in with a low bid. It's hard to say across the board. But ultimately, what it is, and what I really try and emphasize in the piece, is that there's an increasing integration in China's presence, and not just in ports, but specifically in ports. And there's a growing discussion in China about how important it is to not just be doing what are essentially kind of one-off, one and done contracts, which are often, engineering, procurement, construction contracts. Yes, maybe they're paid out of a Chinese loan, and then if they don't have a follow-on contract, they just go home. They've dredged out a harbor, they've built a new pier, they've installed cranes, whatever it is. There's increasing move towards ownership, equity ownership in leases. Depends on the country how that is structured, and operations, which is the area that I've been especially interested in, is a good segue into who's the next Hambantota. Where's the next position where there's really, it's Chinese financed, it's Chinese owned, it's Chinese operated, and has the scale and the geographic position such that it's potentially a real strategic asset. And I think whether or not Equatorial Guinea pans out remains to be seen, but I would say that Gulf of Guinea area is a very, very, very high priority for the PLA Navy as well as for Chinese civilian enterprises and leadership. It is arguably the most significant piracy threat now. And so we know this playbook from Djibouti. There are legitimate reasons why China wants to participate in counter piracy there, but it's also part of a very overtly from the PLA standpoint. This is part of their ability to develop some comfort in operating out of area and get some reps and ultimately develop some infrastructure that can support sustaining operations out there. But they have done more and more exercises with Gulf of Guinea navies to include Nigeria and Ghana and Equatorial Guinea. And I tend to agree with Ovigwe. I think Lekki is a really, really interesting port in Nigeria. And I think that, especially because of the scale of the market there in Nigeria, I would expect that there's a lot more Chinese interest in that. And that also, there's some irony to this, but I think that also makes it a less likely spot for overt militarization because the commercial stakes are so significant in Nigeria. And of course, I wouldn't rule it out, but you're talking about 200 million people. You're talking about Lekki is actually just one of a handful of port projects that China has going in Nigeria. Again, you could look at the table. It's very inconvenient for China to have big ticket infrastructure projects with Chinese finance, Chinese construction, Chinese ownership operations that then become militarized over time. I think it's bad. It's a black eye for the BRI is one way I've thought about it, but it crowds out other things that China is trying to do. And I think it's a lower priority in a place like Nigeria, whereas in Equatorial Guinea, they've been doing a lot of joint training. They're building infrastructure for the Equatorial Guinean military, and obviously have developed quite a close relationship with some of the leadership. And importantly, the key piece there is that leadership is disillusioned with America, and therefore it looks attractive to them, even if the United States is going to be unhappy. It starts to look attractive to them to say, well, maybe we can be a little bit more open to Chinese military presence. But calling something a potential Hambantota is actually it's an interesting question, because Hambantota is not a successful commercial port. Hambantota is a boondoggle, and I wouldn't rule it out over the long term. It is in quite an important place, but Sri Lanka doesn't seem to be a very good place to do business now. And I think there's an interesting confluence of places that are going to be receptive to or indifferent to or unable to monitor China's militarization of a facility and the likelihood of there being commercial success there. That tends to go hand in hand with some type of political instability, probably low governance indicators. And so I think, there's a very short list of countries that I think are lining up to say, we would like to have a major Chinese military presence here. And if you'll permit me, I think this actually relates to the question earlier about security services, because China's proposition when it's speaking bilaterally or even multilaterally, say with Gulf of Guinea nations, is not, we're here to supplant the United States or the British or the French as an external security guarantor. They're very explicit about the narrow frame in which they look at their security. It's Chinese security. It's Chinese assets. It's Chinese citizens. It's Chinese sea lines, whatever it is. They're not proposing alliances. They're not proposing, certainly not groups of alliances. These are, they'll exercise and help partner states develop capacity. And that's, I think, the level of the quid pro quo, and sell technology and do training and things of that nature. But it's not at all on offer that China is going to be your ally and we're going to fight your domestic battles. They just want a position to fight for their own discrete interests, and therefore private security firms, police cooperation, all manner of other sub-military type or paramilitary type interaction, I think, is the most appealing. And it's probably going to be very quiet and it's going to be narrow. And Paul Nantilio deserves a lot of credit for what's ultimately much harder research than ports, for example, which are very public. It's a little hard to observe. On the question from the gentleman from the Commerce Department, I think you probably already know the answer, which is that, U.S. advantages, to your second question, Liz, U.S. advantages that can be gained from Chinese infrastructure are obvious. It's basically that demand signal that I was talking about. If you serve these big markets with modern infrastructure, there's all sorts of commerce and economic activity that can conceivably result. I think the key there is that the United States and its allies and partners help states negotiating with China to set up contracts in terms of their, whether it's the loan, whether it's the EPC contract, whether it's the lease or concession on a port, such that it is open for business for the United States and is essentially an open model for further development. And I think the problem is, and I don't even think it necessarily needs to be deliberate on China's part, it's that there is this natural tendency towards developing an insular Chinese economic ecosystem. They tend to work with other Chinese enterprises. If I'm CCCC, I'm going to subcontract to my subsidiaries and to Chinese firms, and it just kind of goes together. And as Ovigwe was pointing out, developing specifically Chinese standards for whether it's telecoms or rail or ports or you name it, this ends up having kind of a self-reinforcing property to it. And I think breaking that loop has got to be a real priority for US policy, and we can really literally leverage all the capital that China is pouring into not just Africa, but across the developing world. If we have a little bit more engagement with the countries that are negotiating with them, not to say don't take it, as Ovigwe again was pointing out, there's just very strong demand for digital infrastructure, and there's no way to say no. If we're not there offering a substitute, which I don't believe we are, and probably won't be for at least the foreseeable future, there needs to be some value there. And ultimately, I think that any country is interested in negotiating effectively with China and getting their interests met by the terms of their contract or their lease, their concession. I think that's where we can have the most effect.
Thank you, Isaac. We're over time, actually. I want to turn the mic over to Rachel, but I want to thank you all for joining us. Those of you online, thank you as well. Ovigwe, thank you for joining us, my good man. And again, please read the papers that you have. A lot of knowledge in the papers. We couldn't get to everything this morning, but there's an awful lot of data sitting right in the seat with you. Thank you, Nadège. Thank you again, Isaac. Thank you, Ovigwe, and thank you to NBR for inviting me. Rachel?
Thanks, Jill. I want to extend your thanks to our panelists for so ably breaking down these very complex issues, and to all of our online and in-person guests. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that this event helps pull together all the threads of this very multifaceted and complex issue of China's engagement with the African continent. as our panelists so excellently highlighted, there are many different vantage points from which to view this relationship, and it's really crucial to examine China's activities as something that is intersectional. So for those of you who are in person, we do have a grab and go lunch outside of the atrium. So we encourage you to get some food, chat a bit. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.